There are a couple of points of inspiration, phrases like check your financial privilege. The ingredient this supplies for us is this thought that maybe Bitcoin isn't for you, but it's still good. And it's important for those who don't actually need Bitcoin to think about it not just from their own perspective, but from the perspective of perhaps those who need it.
Hello, I am Codyellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I talk with Andrew M. Bailey, professor and co-author of Resistance Money, a philosophical case for Bitcoin. We discuss the book's approach to communicating the idea of Bitcoin from a global perspective, providing strong arguments for Bitcoin's value as a net good for the world. We also talk about the history of political philosophy and how ideas spread, as well as the new interdisciplinary Bitcoin Research Institute at the University of Wyoming, where Andrew will be taking on a role as Professor of Philosophy. If you would like to support my work and growing this show, please consider tipping some Bitcoin to the show's wallet. Otherwise, pass this episode on to a friend who you think may enjoy it. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out. My emails are always open. hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. Otherwise, on to the show. And you're in Singapore?
That's right.
Yeah. How long have you been over there for?
This is my 13th year.
Oh,
so
wow.
a good chunk of my life so far.
And that's with the Yale National University of Singapore, right?
That's right. Yeah. A small liberal arts college here in Singapore.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I was just researching it before. It seems like wasn't it the first liberal arts college in Singapore, or it's some sort of, it was some kind of first? No?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And we're shutting down next year, but it was a glorious experiment while it lasted.
Oh, really? Is that just because of a lack of students, or what is leading to that closure?
It's complicated, but it involves local politics.
I understand.
And the fact that we had many foreign students and foreign faculty, just not popular to have a publicly funded school that has all these foreigners.
Yeah, I understand. Well, look, Andrew, I thought maybe we could start off actually talking about Resistance Money, which I've just finished reading. You kindly gave me a copy to look through, and I found it very fascinating. In particular, the opening section on Bitcoin's genesis was actually quite a really interesting take on sort of the cypherpunk story, where a lot of these different threads of Bitcoin's origin kind of came from. In particular, I think you mentioned Judith Milhon, who was one of the early cypherpunks. Really interesting story there. The Liberty Dollar, some of these different projects. But at a high level, with Resistance Money, I mean, what was your intention with that book, and what were you trying to work through with that? There's
both a bit of advocacy and a bit of research. When you're doing pure research, the goal is to just figure out something for yourself and then write it up in a way that's satisfying first to you, then to your co-authors, and then to concentric and growing audiences from there. So for us, that was really the first goal, was to think carefully about Bitcoin together, to figure out the arguments that work, the ones that don't, and then to write it up in a way that was first satisfying to us, and then to layered audiences from then out. Yeah. But along the way, of course, we discovered that we had strong opinions about some things. And that's where it's part advocacy. It's part trying to express yourself in a way that audiences will listen to.
Yeah.
And one audience that we wanted to reach that hasn't yet been reached is, let's call it normies or academics or people who care about what academics have to say. And that's not everyone. But we think that we have a place to speak to them in ways that other Bitcoin books simply wouldn't, because we're credentialed academics publishing in a peer-reviewed press and going through all the hoops, that maybe we could bring some ideas that are already familiar to some Bitcoiners to an audience that would otherwise ignore or discount them.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your co-authors, Bradley Rettler and Craig Womke, and you guys were working through this together. And your two co-authors, what's their background?
I'm afraid all three of us are philosophy professors.
I see.
So, and indeed, within philosophy, we have some other weird things in common too. All of us are interested, or have been interested in the past, in metaphysics. So we've known each other since grad school and have been friends in various ways. But Bitcoin brought us together in a much more powerful way when working on various articles in this book together.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting the way you approached it. I mean, I've done quite a lot of reading on Bitcoin and also more broadly the role of the state, the history of hegemony, power, these kinds of things. And what really struck me with your book, Resistance Money, is there's this common line of argument about the way people feel about Bitcoin, and I find it is almost a shortcut for shutting down argument or discourse. But actually, it's a technological revolution. It doesn't really matter how you feel about it. There is a real world effect that you need to kind of deal with. And I think the way you laid it out, you talk about this possible worlds approach to kind of assuming that, you're not you, but you're somebody in the world, anybody. And if you were that person, would your life be better with or without Bitcoin in the world? And I thought that really kind of was quite a novel approach to talking about Bitcoin. It didn't assume anything. And I'm sort of curious how you came to that kind of way of sort of getting this idea across.
There are a couple of points of inspiration. One is people like Alex Gladstein, who have had some marvelous arguments and even just little phrases that express those arguments, phrases like check your financial privilege. The ingredient this supplies for us is this thought that maybe Bitcoin isn't for you, but it's still good. And it's important for those who don't actually need Bitcoin to think about it, not just from their own perspective, but from the perspective of perhaps those who need it. Now, that's maybe easier said than done. So we knew that we needed some sort of tool or thought experiment or intellectual device to somehow get our heads out of our heads and into the world writ large and thinking about it from the perspective of others. And just saying, oh, go do that isn't enough. So we turn to classic ideas from the history of political philosophy, including this idea of the veil of ignorance. And it's been used in a variety of ways that I don't find very convincing. But I found it quite useful when evaluating a piece of technology, not just whether it's good for me, but whether it's good for the world, to think about it and kind of, if you can, erase your own identity from those thoughts. So the idea is keep intact everything you know about the world, the way it's fair or unfair, the distribution of resources, how institutions work or sometimes don't work. And then imagine that you could have turned out to be anybody, and then ask for each of those 7 or 8 billion people, well, is Bitcoin, as you say, better? Is their world better with or without Bitcoin? So this helps us get outside of our own perspectives and actually use a little bit of empathic imagination. So that's our intended effect, at least. And of course, this is easier said than done, and it's just a thought experiment. But we found it helpful, at least, so we share it as a gift for readers in the hopes that they can benefit from it too.
Yeah, that idea of the veil of ignorance, what is the history of that in terms of political philosophy? Where did that come from originally, do you know?
There are predecessors of it across a number of dimensions, including in Buddhist thought, in Moist thought, in classical Chinese thought, and the history of Western philosophy. Probably the most famous proponent of it is a philosopher named John Rawls, who taught at Harvard for 40 or 50 years in the late 20th century. And he thought that you could derive the basic principles from which political institutions should be derived by looking behind the veil of ignorance, that is, erase just about everything you know about the world. Now, Rawls actually wasn't the first, even in the Western tradition, to do this. There's an earlier version of the veil of ignorance that we found more useful, which is from John Harsanyi. He's an economist who wrote about this in the 1950s, before Rawls. And the key difference is that when you use a Harsanyi-style veil of ignorance, you're not asked to erase everything you know about the world. In fact, we think it's important to keep in place the empirical facts about the world, about how resources are distributed and the ways that central or commercial banks succeed or fail. So don't erase that. Keep that intact when thinking about institutions or about technologies. But maybe see if you can delete one little piece of knowledge, namely knowledge of who you are. So that's the twist on the veil of ignorance that we like, that comes from Harsanyi.
Interesting. I think looking at, if I reflect on conversations I've had with friends, people who have maybe gone through the academic institution of university and they maybe have strong opinions on the way things ought to be, I have always found it quite challenging to broach the topic of Bitcoin because it kind of undoes preconceptions around the nature of power, the nature of relations between people, and it sort of is it's a new paradigm. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Mark Fisher. He's a philosopher, he's passed away now, but he did a lot of writing on capitalist realism and the idea of...
I don't know. I don't know the name.
No, so it's sort of, I guess, an exploration of this kind of late stage project that we're in, where it's as they say, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I don't think this is a critique of what we think of as capitalism, as in making things and building factories, but maybe the bigger idea that it's hard to extract yourself from the world we're in, which has no real competing ideological systems, and yet it's quite clear that we are entering a new era. Maybe you could call it the end of the nation state, or some kind of fourth turning type event where everything changes. And so I'm curious, is there historical examples of change? I'm thinking maybe the Enlightenment, or sort of how technology maybe has had impacted these periods, that we can maybe reference when we're looking at what Bitcoin is bringing to us today.
You've hypothesized that perhaps we're witnessing the end of the nation state. Myself, I'm a little skeptical about that, just because states have been around for a very long time, and these are powerful institutions that can be quite resilient. So I would myself be pretty cautious about that kind of hypothesis. But I agree that we're at an inflection point, and it's an inflection point that is enhanced, maybe not caused, but enhanced or catalyzed by technology, a number of different tech stacks, in fact. So you asked for possible historical examples for insight. I would look towards other points of technical inflection where that is also united with cultural or social upheaval. Think about things like the invention of the printing press, which has echoes in history and unites with dissatisfaction with the Roman Catholic Church and with the way that society was ruled, especially in continental Europe, and issues in the Great Reformation, which ripples outwards into England, and then which ripples outwards into the American Revolution. So you see these little things, technical changes. The marginal cost of spreading an idea went closer to zero with the invention of the printing press. You could spread ideas much more easily. So as long as people are literate, and as long as they know how to make new printing presses, and you keep it in your basement, it's a fairly censorship-resistant technology in that sense. You can start spreading ideas. And maybe the most important thing that's birthed from that technical revolution and united with a social upheaval is the American Revolution. The most read book in the American colonies prior to the Revolution was the Bible. The second most read book was Locke's second treatise on government. And it was printed as a little pamphlet, and you can find these in museums. There are thousands of them. I actually have a copy right here because I was reading this earlier today. So here's a printed edition that we have now. It's very thin. It's actually even smaller with columns, the way it was circulated in the colonies. Super cheap to reproduce. And the idea of this little booklet is that it's okay to overthrow an unjust king. And then it spreads like wildfire, and the Americans get very upset about a 2% tax, and all of a sudden they're overthrowing the king. Mm-hmm. So I see inflections like that where social change is united with a technical innovation that allows for asymmetric advantages as maybe places we could look to for what Bitcoin might do. Now, it's not a violent revolution, and the technical change in some ways is probably less world-changing, at least so far, than the printing press. Now, some Bitcoiners are very bullish that it will be more important than the printing press or the personal firearm. I say wait and see.
So just pulling on that thread, so you mentioned the printing press, which is a classic example of this kind of technology that then flows downstream into a political change. And I am just wondering, maybe it's early days for Bitcoin, but certainly it feels like it has the potential to be on that scale of change to lead to maybe the downfall of what we see as the democratic nation-state system that has basically been birthed from fiat money and the mainstream adoption of democratic principles globally. But I don't know, it feels like that's beginning to unwind. I mean, there's a lot of chaos in the world. What is your reluctance to maybe think about this as being on that scale?
I think people are risk averse, and one way is that risk aversion gets expressed is turning to authorities to keep things going more or less as we hope that they will. And we want those authorities to sometimes enforce the rules with violence. And when people gather together and have authorities that enforce rules with violence, we call those states. And I suspect that this is pretty deep in human nature, the instinct to express our risk aversion in this way. And of course, it can be expressed in an authoritarian way where the authority has too much power. And then we resist that. or at least some portion of human beings will resist that. But an appreciable fraction of humanity, we show with our behavior that we actually don't value liberty that much and are okay with authorities telling us what to do. So just given the long history of human beings who have created authorities to do just this, I'm skeptical that that will change anytime soon. And I would think of Bitcoin, if it is going to have these long, big and long time horizon effects on how human society is arranged, it probably won't be Bitcoin alone. It'll be the whole cryptography tech stack that might enable this. Things like encrypted end-to-end messaging, anonymous browsing of the internet through Tor, censorship-resistant publishing through Nostr, things like that. So I'm not saying that any particular app within those categories is going to change the world, but maybe in some together, especially if they are united in various ways, as when Lightning clients talk to each other over Nostr, or when you have like a deep integration of a messaging platform that's encrypted with these other tech stacks. Okay, that's the sort of thing that could maybe have these bigger long-scale effects. But wait and see is my fundamental stance.
Interesting.
There. Bitcoin is 15 years old, so that's long enough to start making some guesses, but short enough that we have to say wait and see on a lot of these 100, 200, 3-year time horizon predictions.
Interesting. I mean, pulling on that a little bit further, I mean, I do think there's something about our current situation where we look at things, I think, just naturally through the lens of democratic mass participation, these kinds of ways of seeing change. But it is also possible that it's an intransigent minority of, a few million Bitcoiners, for example, that have such an asymmetrical power advantage over nation-state fiat money and that existing power structure that there's this massive flippening of the logic of violence as talked about in something like The Sovereign Individual, where, you've got this new, virtual colony of, the 13 colonies of the Bitcoin world that kind of say, no, we don't want to participate anymore. And that is locked up in that is a lot of wealth. And I just wonder, I mean, this gets more into visionary thinking about what it could be, but certainly it doesn't need to be used by everyone for it to have massive change. And I just wonder if we can look at things, or if there's, I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on philosophical approaches to understanding something like that. How does something like that take place in a new paradigm of relations between people and the state?
One way that small groups of people can have asymmetric power is not just when they have asymmetric tools like firearms or printing presses or Bitcoin clients running full validating nodes, but also when they are willing to make great sacrifices, and the very threat of that can change the game theory. So if you know that there's somebody playing a game with you who's kind of a maniac in this respect, their risk function is very different than yours, they're willing to take big risks in order to protect their Bitcoins or to protect their loved ones using firearms, or some other thing that for many of us would feel pretty radical to do, that can actually change how authorities behave, because they don't want something so disruptive. They don't want a maniac doing something that's highly risky for the maniac. And so it changes what the authority is, the next move that they will make in the game. So here's a concrete example with Bitcoin in particular. If you know that there's a bunch of Bitcoiners out there who are willing to trade all of their value for Bitcoin, they've already traded, let's say, 50% of their net worth, and if you push, they'll trade the other 50%. That's a massive exit of value from a system that you might otherwise control. This gives you an incentive when you have even a small group of people that are willing to do something radical and risky. It can give authorities incentives to behave. And the concrete case of this is central banks who are worried about losing customers. And those customers are commercial banks and retail users of banknotes, of bank deposits in that system, and so on. And so if they're scared of that, even on the margin, because losing 10% of the value in the system or 10% of the people could hurt the bottom line or make them lose political credibility. So a credible threat of exit can sometimes be enough.
That's interesting.
To incentivize an authority to behave. So if this is right, what that means is that central banking would have been even worse these last 15 years without Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And maybe that's true. It's hard to evaluate that counterfactual, but it might well be that the existence of Bitcoin is already having that effect by scaring people into behaving.
Well, another way of looking at it, I mean, certainly there's a dogmatic Bitcoin rhetoric around the issue of central banking, but I actually had the former governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand on this show recently, and he's the man famous for the 0 to 2% inflation target everyone talks about. But you know what was interesting is that in the 1970s, 1980s in the US and in New Zealand, inflation was like 15%. You had the oil shocks, you had a whole lot of issues, and the new brand of inflation targeting central banking that emerged after that was like quite a massive improvement over what was happening before. And the basic mechanism was the separation of government and central bank functions, as you have with the US. You've got the Fed and, the Department of Treasury is, they're kind of politically separate entities. And, in the eyes of a statist, you would think that's actually a massive improvement. They got price stability to a really good place, even if it's still 2-3%. And so there is actually quite a different argument there that, things were worse before and now they've gotten better. And now Bitcoin's kind of a criticism of the best form of central banking. But it's sort of, I don't know, inspecting that relationship between the way central banking has unfolded and kind of where it's heading is quite interesting as well.
One empirical thing to pay attention to is the behavior of central banks when they're doing something naughty or disruptive and whether they block the exits. An example from this year is the Central Bank of Egypt, which overnight, literally while people were sleeping, devalued the currency by 20%. So they adjusted the reserve portfolio and a peg mechanism within their management of the local currency. And then simultaneous with that, they blocked the ability of people to withdraw to US dollar denominated accounts or to withdraw to basically to stable coins or to Bitcoin, access to exchanges or foreign bank accounts by which they would get access to exchanges. So that tells you, not just through they probably wouldn't say this aloud, but it tells you through their behavior that they see competition. And that awareness of competition is evidence that at least some necessary condition of this dynamic is actually in place, which is that the central banks are looking to alternatives and scared that people leave for them. So to the extent that that happens, that's actually evidence that Bitcoin is making our world better than what it would otherwise have been, even if it's not optimal. So it can discipline these legacy institutions in that way.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, the central banker that I interviewed, we were talking about the idea that New Zealand doesn't have capital controls, other countries do. And in the case of Egypt that you just mentioned, it sounded like that was maybe to kind of curtail movement into the US dollar or other fiat currencies. But
that's right.
Certainly his take was quite optimistic that we don't see capital controls in these major developed Western countries, and maybe at the point we do, then we can start thinking about what's going on. But it seems as if the capital controls exist within the fiat world for stopping people getting US dollars or other stable currencies. But have we seen any attempts to really effectively implement capital controls against stable coins and Bitcoin anywhere globally?
Not of that kind. Not really. Of course, there's heavy regulation of on-ramps and off-ramps. And of course, it could be hard for people, even in places like the United Kingdom or the United States, to get access to exchanges, but not at this scale. And it doesn't appear to have that intention behind it, compared to a bank that is, doing something that you kind of know is going to piss people off, and that very day blocking the exits. Yeah,
that's interesting.
The United Kingdom just makes it hard for UK citizens to have access to Bitcoin exchanges. But, that's just annoying regulation. It doesn't appear to have the same intent.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, on that note of blocking the exits, there's certainly regulation that's problematic, and it makes it hard to run a Bitcoin business or to interface with the fiat world. Certain countries, certainly Japan, is quite difficult to even do anything with the fiat world. But one sort of idea that I've been thinking about a lot is the idea that Bitcoin thrives with the rejection of that system of regulation, in the sense that if you want to play the fiat game, you're going to have a hard time, but Bitcoin natively actually works perfectly fine. Anyone can access it. It is permissionless and censorship resistant. So there's sort of, again, there's kind of butting of forces, there's kind of hegemonic relationship that is hard because we're seeing more and more financialization of Bitcoin through things like ETFs and massive exchanges, and kind of these recurring issues that, hardcore Bitcoiners will think, that's not a good thing. But yet that is seeming to be still quite popular with the average person.
And this is something that I'm watching carefully, whether the financialization of Bitcoin is equal to the taming of Bitcoin. And for me, that would be an upsetting reality were it to unfold. If it turned out that all the properties that make Bitcoin the most interesting to me, its resistance money features, were systematically undermined by the creation of ETFs, the wide use of Bitcoin in regulated exchanges as a tool of speculation only, things like that.
Yeah. Just one other thing then, while we're talking about resistance money. So for me, I thought your book really described some interesting arguments, the sort of thing that I could see communicating well with someone who was maybe skeptical or already had preconceptions around Bitcoin. It sort of laid it out in a way that didn't require, it wasn't preaching to the choir, let me put it that way. It really laid out, good arguments.
We have some great sermons already for the choir.
Yes.
We'd like to try to speak to some others.
Yeah, the catechisms of new people coming in. And we are looking at the political philosophy here. And I'm thinking, is there not a new kind of field of study? And I'm looking at something to sit alongside Hobbes or Hegel or Locke in the sense of the relationship between money and state, and sort of a broader body of work that maybe isn't just relying on general philosophy principles, but actually is a new, I guess, ism that can be looked at. And I mean, are you seeing the emergence of that? Is that something you're interested in, perhaps?
This is something that has quite unexpectedly to me emerged in my own teaching, which is that money is really interesting to students, and the way to think about it is across disciplines. And so sometimes I call that philosophy of money, but it's not just philosophy. It's part economics, part politics, and when Bitcoin's at play, part computer science and cryptography too. So I'm not going to say that this is some exciting new field that a bunch of people are going to be thinking about, but I like thinking about it, and I found it very exciting in the classroom, and students pay attention. They want to learn about this stuff in a kind of capacious, disciplinary crossing way, and money is the thing that pulls them in. Yeah. Because once you look at money, you realize, of course, I've always wanted some. That's the easy thing to notice about money, but there are more subtle things to notice and care about there too. And once you look at them, it's hard to forever look away.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a good segue then, this idea of a cross-disciplinary approach to understanding Bitcoin and money. And it could be a good segue into your work with the University of Wyoming and the new Bitcoin Research Institute there. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about that, please, Andrew.
Brad Rettler and I have been friends for a long time, and we've been in Bitcoin and thinking about it together for a long time. And we've wanted to start something to get other people interested in Bitcoin in the academy, thinking seriously about it. And one reason that we've cared about that a lot is that we found that a lot of the misinformation about Bitcoin, sometimes unintentional and sometimes it appears to be malicious misinformation, comes from academics. It comes from credentialed people with PhDs. And the only way to fight lies is with the truth. So we've started that cause with our book and with other articles. But our thought is to expand a little bit. So the Bitcoin Research Institute at the University of Wyoming, we got a seed gift of $1.5 million that in part will pay for me to join the University of Wyoming next year. And in part will fund things like an annual summer workshop where we can bring in both senior scholars who are experienced and young people, either young professors or graduate students who want to learn more about Bitcoin, to get started in their own research careers, publishing high-quality, peer-reviewed academic work about Bitcoin, spanning energy and engineering, philosophy, economics, politics, anthropology, other social sciences, and more besides. And the University of Wyoming was, as it turned out, just a terrific place to do this. First, because it's in Wyoming, which is Bitcoin country. Second, because Brad is already there. And third, because Senator Lummis is one of the 2 U.S. senators from Wyoming. And around those various hubs or nodes, there's enough of a critical mass. So I will be there next year. We'll run our first summer workshop, hopefully in June of 2025, and slowly build from there. Maybe hiring more people, having annual essay contests, and supporting research that other academics are doing at legitimate academic institutions across the world who are really interested in telling the truth about Bitcoin. Our goal is not to spread propaganda about Bitcoin. So in no case will condition of getting a research grant from the Bitcoin Research Institute be saying something positive about Bitcoin. It's more like we just want to fund high quality research, people who are actually interested in learning and telling the truth. And Bitcoiners who are convinced that Bitcoin is good should be happy because the truth is on their side. So if you think this sounds like a cool thing and you're listening to this, you could actually give money. And in particular, you can give Bitcoin to the Bitcoin Research Institute, and we're authorized to take it. And if we don't even need to sell it, we can hold it in the foundation's treasury. So there's my little pitch. Thank you for listening.
No, that's awesome. And what's tell me about Wyoming. Like, what makes Wyoming special in a political, social sense that Bitcoin is popular there? That we've had the emergence of this stuff in Wyoming.
Wyoming is unique among American states in a couple of dimensions. It's the least populated, and it's the most libertarian in orientation. Probably the only state that can rival it for liberty or libertarianness is Alaska. A lot of people, there aren't many, but the people who have moved to Wyoming or who stay there, they want to be left alone. That's why they're there. It's a big open space in the mountains with not a lot of people. So the kind of people who stay in Wyoming or who move there are already oriented towards liberty. They care about freedom. And sometimes that finds expression in who they elect into office. And sometimes it finds expression culturally too. The University of Wyoming is less, I would say, cowed by academic orthodoxy. And you can see that in a couple of ways. They already have a center that studies gun rights. And it's funded in part by the kinds of people who fund the National Rifle Association. Now, this is not popular in most academic circles or most university campuses in the United States. I'm not endorsing it, saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that's the sort of thing that you would not see allowed on campus at Cal Berkeley or at UCLA or at the University of Chicago or New York University. It just wouldn't happen. Wyoming, they're perfectly fine with that. And perhaps for similar reasons, they're perfectly fine and indeed eager to sponsor high quality Bitcoin research. So that's the kind of cultural or political environment that I suspect is what made it possible for us to launch the BRI and why it's in Wyoming in particular.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this role of the academic institutions engaging with Bitcoin. I recently talked with Murray Rudd, who I believe you may be familiar with.
Yes,
about
Murray's terrific.
Yeah, Satoshi Action education and just getting more of this stuff into circulation with some of these institutions, and in particular the research that often is used when it comes to referencing, or it's often used when you're approaching policymakers, for example. They kind of request, or there's an expectation that there's peer-reviewed research behind policy recommendations and suggestions. So it sort of helps, I guess, on that side as well, engaging with the Leviathan of the state and the way it tries to regulate things. And there just hasn't been that much of it until now.
That's right. And that's not the only way to clean up the misinformation pipeline, but it is one important way to actually publish high-quality, peer-reviewed research. There's room for, let's call it cypherpunk research too. This is just somebody learning something and writing a blog post and publishing it. Jameson Lopp does this sort of thing. He'll just study something obsessively for a few weeks and then write this great 3,000-word blog post. And had it been gussied up and presented in the right way, it could totally be academic research, but it doesn't need to be. He's not an academic. He doesn't need their credentials. He doesn't need those gold stars on his resume. So he just publishes it. So in my view, there's room for all sorts of research, but because there are people in power who pay attention to things like whether something's peer-reviewed or not, it's important to get the truth there as well.
Yeah. So that's starting off next year. And do you think there might be an emergence of this kind of thing more broadly in the United States or globally, where universities take on research departments looking at Bitcoin, for example?
I think that depends in part on whether we can succeed. So people will look at that, and that will in part gauge their own sense of whether this is a good thing or not, whether Bitcoin is succeeding, and whether Bitcoiners actually want to fund this kind of research. In fact, crypto research, not Bitcoin, but the rest of crypto, is very well funded in academia. There are a number of blockchain centers and institutes that study cryptocurrency and the decentralization of this or that. And they're all funded by ICO money and by foundations that are associated with some crypto token or coin. Millions and millions of dollars a year are spent on these things. Now, Bitcoin doesn't have a foundation. It doesn't have a CEO. It doesn't have a known founder. It doesn't have any of this stuff. So high quality Bitcoin research is actually really thin compared to the rest of crypto. And it's for that reason, it's the differential in funding. So in part, it's in the hands of Bitcoiners whether they care about this and whether they want to open their own pocketbooks, because there is no president of Bitcoin to do it for them. Yeah. So this is our blessing and our curse, that we are, in fact, let's say, maybe the word right here is decentralized, or in this respect at least, we don't have a leader and we don't have a foundation to run the show for us. And when you're trying to get an upgrade through and just like make something good happen, that really sucks, because there's no Ethereum foundation to just publish the canonical client that upgrades Bitcoin in some way. There just isn't. On the other hand, if you're subject to a bunch of Wells notices from the SEC, it's kind of nice that there's no lawyer's office that they can send it to, and no foundation and no corporation. There's nothing. So pluses and minuses. Myself, I think the pluses outweigh the minuses, but one of the minuses certainly is the ability to actually fund research.
Yeah, interesting. I'm just curious on that point. I mean, this is an ongoing issue. It's become mimetic at this point, sort of Bitcoin, not crypto. And I just wonder whether you have any high-level takes, I mean, philosophically or socially around how this has emerged, because it sometimes seems like, I mean, for us, it's so obvious that, well, there's this thing. It's not even worth being on a blockchain. It's just a waste of time. Yet it always seems to have more money behind it, more ICO traction, etc. I mean, do you think there's something there that we can understand philosophically around how that has come to be?
I'm not sure. It's not easy to communicate what, as you say, seems so clear to us in a way that's actually compelling to an outsider. Because to an outsider, it sounds like you're picking one stock in this list of 500 stocks and saying, yeah, this one's the best. You're an Apple guy or a Tesla guy, and you're saying Apple only, no, never buy Dell, never buy Tesla, never buy Facebook or Amazon. And to an outsider, it's just going to sound a little nutty. Like, no, I want exposure to a wide variety of tech stocks. So I'm going to at least think about and maybe even buy a bunch of tech stocks. That is the model that I think, or something like that is the model that people are taking to this. And so they see a Bitcoiner who says Bitcoin only, and like, no. In terms of portfolio design and attention, we can allocate attention just as we allocate capital. I'm going to allocate attention in this wide and diversified way. Now, many of us have found the hard way that allocating attention to all these various crypto projects is kind of a drag, because most of them are scams and it's a waste of your time. Unfortunately, the way that we learn that is by being burned, either by having wasted our time as when allocating attention, or wasting money as when allocating capital, and then the project goes to, from something against Bitcoin is 90% down against Bitcoin after 5 years, a fairly typical tale for a crypto token. Not universally so, but very typical. And unfortunately, the only way to learn that is to just get burned. The idiom is sometimes you have to touch the stove. Yeah. So that kind of sucks that pain is the best teacher, but pain is indeed the best teacher, and not all of us have felt that pain. And so we have some hard lessons ahead of us.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the veil of ignorance earlier, and I just wonder again if there is not a historical example where we can see the emergence of technology. I mean, maybe the automobile, there's sort of, early critiques of it. And I know certainly, I think it's Parker Lewis quotes the idea that time converts more people than reason in his book, Gradually Then Suddenly, this kind of idea that maybe, we don't have arguments, even though we think our logic works well, that we don't have arguments that can convince people, but time passes, the value of Bitcoin increases, and that's enough maybe for people to see the way, potentially.
The phrase I like in this connection from that old movie, The Shawshank Redemption, is time and pressure. So this is how geological change happens. This is also how cognitive change happens. It's time plus pressure. Time, that unfolds naturally enough. And as long as central banks behave irresponsibly, as long as corporations try to block payments or otherwise censor these networks, that will provide pressure on the margin too. So these forces can be subtle and small and the local level, but together, when unfolding, they can, as in the geological case, move mountains. So there's something to that perspective. And for anyone who's argued on the internet for very long or tried to argue with anyone with any depth about, let's say, the existence of God or the nature of free will or any of these big picture topics, you'll realize that trying to change somebody's minds with arguments alone isn't going to do the trick. Sometimes an argument can, even if it didn't change your mind in the moment, plant a seed that together with some external pressure will yield fruit in 20, 30 years' time.
Yeah. And I guess just the final thing, Andrew, I thought could be interesting is to get maybe your thoughts on recommendations. Obviously, Resistance Money as one book for people to read, but in terms of understanding...
Thank you. And thank you, Cody, by the way, for reading it. I really appreciate that. That's very kind.
It was really enjoyable. But in terms of recommendations for books on political philosophy, metaphysics, things that are relevant to this discourse, have you got any recommendations that stand out?
One book in political philosophy that I've been turning to more and more in recent years and has become more relevant, not less, is On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. And this is the classic case for the value of liberty, which is more or less the ability of individuals to live life as they please, provided they don't harm others. And the thing that caught my eye a couple years ago, and that I've been teaching it basically once a year as part of this program that I teach in at Yale and US College, is that he emphasizes that impingements on liberty don't only come from the state. They can come from social custom and from other institutions that limit us and box us in our ability to express who we really are. And that seems to me to be maybe more true or more useful now than maybe even than it was in Victorian England when Mill was writing. So that's a book that, because of my teaching schedule, I've been thinking about approximately once a year for the last 10 years. And every time I return to it, it seems better and more important than before. So
yeah, that's excellent. And Andrew, if people want to follow your work, maybe the unfolding story of what you're going to be doing at University of Wyoming Bitcoin Research Institute, where can they follow you?
You can find me on Twitter or X. My handle is Resistance Money, and you can find my authorial team at the website resistance.money. There you can also find our Nostr NPubs and a big long list of podcasts we've been on, something like 30 or 40 by now, and many articles we've written and more besides. So you can find more about us than you ever needed or wanted to know at resistance.money.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Cody. You're very kind to have me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am codyellingham, and that was The Transformation of Value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.